Hi, this is Joe Bolen, and welcome back to VisualBasic.net. We're going to learn more about a user-defined class. In the last two videos on class, we've talked about the concepts of properties and the constructor. And then the second one, we actually created a very simple class called the student class that used auto-implements of the properties for the class. And we created a simple two-string override to return back the data that we might have of data that's in that class. This time we're going to add a little bit more robustness to our class and take advantage of fully defined properties in our class to do some business rules that we're going to introduce into our class so that we can control the kind of data coming in, making certain it satisfies what we want for our data. In other words, we're putting in our business rules into our class, and if the data is satisfied, we'll create a object with all the properties with that information. If it's not, we won't accept that data. We'll throw an exception back to whatever called that class to say, hey, the data must be right. Here's what you need to know about what you did wrong. So let's get into our program that we've been working on, and we'll add to it, and we're going to finish out the program by adding a list of student classes instead of using the array. The array, we have to keep track of how many elements we have in the array. And once the array is full, we either redimension it or we have to stop. This time we're going to use a collection of our student class so that we can just keep adding and adding and adding as many students as we need to into our program. So let's get into our code, into Visual Studio, and begin the process. Okay, before I get into it, let's first of all talk about where the documentation for this and the other two videos were. Out at Enter is the main screen that we're working with, and the summary screen is also out there at the second link. And then the code that I'm working on in this particular video is at Pastebin, and of course other videos that are related to things that I've created for VisualBasic.net are at Bolen Presents at YouTube.com. So if you need to, pause your video, copy down the URLs, and then come back later and study what you've learned in this video. Or incorporate it into your own program and modify it for your own use. So let's get into learning more about our program. First of all, let's review real quickly. We have a form that we've been working with. It's a very simple form. On that, where we have last name and first name and last name. We have three buttons that take care of adding our data. And what we are doing is creating a student class on that. And I'll go to the student class and we'll take a look at it. And right now we have basic auto-implemented properties of student ID, first name and last name. We have the default constructor, and we have our two-string function that has to override the base class to work properly. And we're returning back the ID, first name and last name for our string function. Well, first of all, let's make this a little bit more robust. So I'm going to comment out the auto-implemented version here, and we're going to introduce a fully defined property. So I'm going to hit in prop, and then I'm going to hit the tab key twice. Now bring in our code snippet. Now what you see here is the private property that came in is what's called the backing variable. It will hold the value of our property. So between calls, that is holding the information about the data that we have assigned to that property. So we assign it to that value, and then we go to that backing variable and return the data for our property. So our property in this case is student ID. So I'm going to call this one student ID value. And this one's not a string, but an integer. And my property is going to be called student ID. And what I'm going to do is modify, and you'll see here now I have a full get and set, the getter and setter on that. So when I want to get the value, I'll be coming into the getter part of this, which will be returning back the backing variable. And when I want to assign it to the property, here's where I come in with the setter part. I'm taking the value coming in and assigning it to the backing variable. Now what I want to do just before I assign it though is validate it. And this is where we start to introduce business rules into our class, which gives us a better protection of the data that we're entering in. So I'm going to say if value is less than 0 or less than 1. I don't want a 0 ID. Then what I'm going to do is throw a new augment exception, augment exception, out of range exception on that. And I'm going to send back saying student ID must be a positive whole number on that. So what I'm going to do is take care of that. If not, then I'm going to process the data. So I've introduced a business rule to take care of that. Now this is throwing an error back to the particular area where this property was trying to be assigned incorrectly. Now let's add another property on that. Let's add with the prop tab. We're going to enter in first name value as string, and this will be first name on that. And here once again we want to introduce a business rule into this. So if value, no, I'm going to change that a little bit. If string is null or white spaces coming in this case it's the value that's coming in, then I'm going to throw an exception. In this case I'm going to throw new argument null exception on that, and I'm going to say that first name must have a value. And I'm going to do the same thing for last name. So I'm going to do prop tab, and this is going to be last name value as string, and property is going to be last name on it. And I'm going to do the exact same thing here. So I'm just going to copy and paste this one in to our validation rules. And this time I'm going to say last name must have a value on it. So I've got 3 business rules I've introduced, and I've introduced the full definition of a property in here instead of using the auto-implemented version. Now in a class we can have both auto-implemented and fully defined ones, and we can even have ones that have only the getter or only the setter on that as we work with properties. We're just looking at the basics right now as we're learning about classes. Now one other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new constructor as well and have a different way to initialize. One of them we could have is just simply public new sub new, and I'm going to say by value ID as integer, and I hit that, and I'm going to say that student ID is going to be assigned the ID that I'm sending it. So I could initialize with a brand new student user-defined class, passing in just the ID, and I'll create that with the student ID already filled in. Let's have one other overload on this, called an overload. I'm going to have public sub new. This time I'm going to have by val, and I'll have ID as integer. Then I'll also have by val, first name as string, and by val, last name as string. And then I'm going to set student ID to ID, first name to my first name value being passed in, and my last name as last name on that. There we go. So I've got three different ways now in my constructor on that to get my class created with the student.new method on that. So we've introduced our fully fledged defined properties with a business rule about how that value has to be for the three different properties we're working with. And we've also introduced two additional constructors that will be a way that we can initialize our class. Now we can also have optional parameters being passed in, but you'll notice that the positioning of the parameters as I add ones have to be in the same order. So ID always has to be the first one, since I defined this one as the first one. So there is your constructors on that in our class. So I'm going to save that. Let's go back to our student form in terms of our process. At this point now, I'm going to show you that we now have a way for an error to be checked. I'm going to leave everything as is, and we're going to watch this error up as I process it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start. I'm going to quickly show you that if I just type in first name and do not do the last name, we're going to get an error as I try to do an add. And you'll see that I've got the exception being thrown on that. It's unhandled. So that's exactly what we want to see have happen in our program. That'll also happen for the first name as well. So let's correct that by going back to our student form and protecting ourselves as we process that. So what I'm going to do is put a try catch block in here. So there's try, and if I'm going to catch it, EX as exception, and then I'm going to do something, and then I'm going to do a in try. Okay, now what I'm going to do in the area here of the catching it is I want to take the exception message and display it to the user. So I'm going to do message box show, and what I'm going to show is the message itself that was part of that error. I'm going to put the title of my form in there. We're going to make this message box buttons yes no, or okay, I mean, because there won't be an option for the user, and we're going to make the error message icon as a error icon. There we go. I'll make this a little easier to read here. I'll break that up, and once I have displayed the message, what I want to do at that point is I want to reset my focus on my first name text box. So I'm going to go first name text box focus, and I'll put the cursor back into there, and then I'm going to exit out of the subroutine. So I'll do exit sub there. And so if I have a problem as I'm working with this and trying to add the student in or adding any of the property things, I'll jump down to the catch routine, I'll display a message, and then I'll go to the first name text box with my cursor and exit the sub and won't process any further. Now let's watch it run. Okay, let's put in just my first name, skip the last name, hit add student, and we'll see that an error message now is being displayed. Value cannot be null. Parameter name, last name must have a value. And that was the message that we created when we did a throw of the exception. Let's do it also for the first name. Let me skip that and put in just my last name and do an add student, and we'll see that that one also worked. So our business rule kicked in. We see first name must have a value. So now we have a way to check for errors so that I must have a valid first name and last name to add a student, and once I do, then I have a student that I can display. So that's how we add more robustness to our programming, by creating a business rule in our student class that we have, letting that business class area of the student that we've created be the area where we check for problems, and not in the user interface of the form itself. Now let's add one last part to this that will make this even a better program. It's working fine as is, but the problem is we have to deal with worrying about the student array. And a better thing than a student array is using a list of a collection of students. So I'm going to change this from this particular one. I'm going to just comment it out. And we're not going to use an array, but we're going to use a collection. So I'm going to define a private students as list. In this case, list of student. So this is a list of T. Okay, so that's a collection. Now with that in place, instead of adding to the array, we're going to be adding to a list. And for that, we'll change this. We'll be using students again. Now it's a collection, and we're going to do the add method on that collection and add students. There we go. Oh, and I forgot one little thing up here on students. We've got to declare that as new. We've got to instantiate that collection. Private students as new list of student, and then we're going to add to the collection of students, the list of students, our brand new student that we have here. And now I don't need to worry about the add student button, because I won't have to worry about exceeding an array. So I can literally knock this part out. For this case, I'll just comment it out so we don't have to worry about it. Now as we come down to our display though, I've got to change the way I output my information for the display. So this one becomes actually a lot easier. We're going to iterate through our list by using the for each. So I'm going to say for each student in students, the students list. On that, what I want to do is take the output, append line, and I'm going to take that student from my each here, which is of the student class, and go to the toString method on that we defined in our class, and I'm going to comment out the one we had for array on that. There we go. So now we've changed it. It's much simpler. I don't have to worry about checking to see how many I have. I'm just going to process any student I have in my student collection on that, my list, and I don't have to worry about the add button being enabled or not. It's fine as is. And once again, even the display button could be set now because it wouldn't show anything at all, but I'll just leave that as is. We've got our try catch, the catching errors on it. So let's watch this now. And I'm going to go ahead and add to our program not only our 5 that we had to start out with, but I'll add one more to show you that we now can see that. So I add Joe Bolen, add student. I'm going to add Kathy. Going to add Tim. Whoops. Going to add Frank. And now I'm going to add Sally. Now, just to show you, I'm going to display the student, and right now we've got our 5 that we would have had originally. Now I'm going to go back and add a 6th one, so I'm going to add Dan Selby. Add student, and now I'm going to display it, and we'll see that I can now add even more. So the list is a nice way to go. You'll be using a list a lot. Now, let me tell you about this program a little bit before I end the video. This is a good example of using the list as a collection of our user-defined class student. And if you think about it, we could then use the stream reader and stream writer to make the data persist past ending the program. So at the beginning of the program, I could use a stream reader to read in from a file my collection, and then I could use the stream writer at the end of the program to write it back out to a file so I could preserve my data. Right now, everything is just in memory, but this is an idea that you could work with and add to. And as you work with databases, you'll start to use more of the class defined for something, and you'll use a list of a class that you've made. So this is a nice little program to get yourself with your head wrapped around the concept of a class and learning how to create a not only auto-implemented version of properties in that class, but the fully defined property with a backing variable that's private in your class. And you saw that I typed in prop, then hit tab, and Visual Studio's code snippet pops in and fills out a template for us to create our property very easily. So you don't have to remember every part of the getter setter part of making a property. And there are much more you can learn about the getter and setter, making things read only or write only in the properties area. But we looked at just the basics of a property in our class. We looked at also that we can have different ways to have a constructor in our program. In fact, one thing I'm going to show you as we conclude is a different way to do the creating of the class. Instead of just class new, we're going to actually create one and put data in it right away. So let's finish up with that, and then we'll call it a day for learning about classes. So let's go back into our code. And now I'll show you the different way. We've been just using the basic default constructor of new student. I'm going to comment this out, and we're going to change that. And we're going to use that new constructor that we created on that. And what I'm going to do is get that set up here and we're going to use that third constructor that I had. So I'm going to do dim add student as new student. And now I'm going to use one of my overrides. You see I have 3 overrides here. There's my second one for just ID. And my third one gives me ID, first name, and last name. So I'm just going to type in here student count +1 +1. Then I'm going to put in the last name text box, or first name text box. And the last name text box. There we go. Now, to make it a little easier to read here, I'm going to break this up a little bit so you can see it a little easier on it. So we're actually passing in now using our third constructor that we had in our student class. We're using this constructor to create our new student in our form, and it'll work just like the one above that uses the default constructor. And just to show you, I'll do it real quickly. Add one in. And it works just fine. Add it in, and there I am in our new one. So we have the override of the constructor used in here, and we've created the default constructor. We had a couple other constructors that we had in here. We're using this one to show you that you can pass in the parameters and create everything right away and when you create the student class. So that'll get you up and running with learning about using a class. We created a class with only 3 properties. Of course, you'll have a class with much more properties. You'll create business rules in that class to validate the data. You'll throw exceptions back to the user interface area to say that this data needs to be corrected before I process it. And you'll display that message by catching that error with a try catch block and displaying that either in a message or using an error provider or some other mechanism to display the problem that you might have trying to give a value to one of the properties of your user-defined class. So this gives you an idea of the class, how to define things. Hope you've enjoyed this. Take advantage also of the list collection. That gives you more power than just a strict array. And so we've added a lot of nice features to this little program to make it pretty nice demonstration of a user class. So until next time, take care. Get your hands dirty in the code. Try out this program. Go out to Pastebin at the location I gave you and download the code, work with it, understand it, and have fun. Take care.